week, and then we'll add the rest of the 10. So I have been tasked to do this in 30 minutes. It's trying to compress things that we've gathered over the past few years into 30 minutes. There's a lot that I will not be discussing, but which as we study prophecy, we'll get to expand on and you'll get to understand. The things that we will be doing for this week, it's an introduction, and then thereafter, it's going to be digging right into prophecy and starting studying the Bible, because there are people who have made a valid observation that a lot of Christians, we spend a lot of time reading books about the Bible and not actually reading the Bible. So that's something that we're going to avoid. So as from next week, we'll be starting from chapter 1 in the book of Daniel. To recap on what we did last week. So one of the big things that we're doing as we are approaching our study of prophecy is that we're looking at the Bible as a whole. Because one of the things that we noticed is that as Christians, we look at one section, come up with a conclusion, but don't put it into context of the whole Bible. So whatever chapters or books of the Bible that you're studying, it needs to be put into context of the whole Bible, New Testament and Old Testament, for you to get an accurate understanding of what it's about. So the ones that we discussed last week, the keys to opening prophecy we discussed last week, the first one was that the Bible needs to be viewed in its entirety. And the one other mistake that we tend to make as Christians is that we read a verse or a chapter and it's like you're in a forest and all you're doing is looking at one specific tree. So what we're trying to do with this is to zoom out so that you look at the whole forest and then you then find the context of what you are actually studying. So that's one of the things we'll be emphasizing. So that was the first key. Second key is that you'll find that there's literal interpretation and there's symbolic things in prophecy. And we discussed about how if it makes sense literally when you read the sentence, then take it literally. But if what you read is not making sense, like it's talking about dragons and those are not practical things, then it means that it's symbolic. So a simple rule of deciding whether something is literal or symbolic. The key number 3 was that the scriptures are their own expositors. So if you find that there's something you don't understand, you don't go outside the Bible to look for the explanation, but you essentially find a concordance and you look for similar verses in the Bible. And most of the time, the mystery that you have will open up and unfold if you stay within the scriptures. Key number 4 that we discussed was that the Bible has a lot of repeating and enlarging, whereby the same story is told, and it's told a second time, sometimes a third and fourth time. Each time new details are added. So that is a repeat and enlarge concept, which we'll come across a lot, especially in the book of Daniel as we start, you'll see that. And then the 5th key that we discussed was the key of cycles. And what we discussed about the cycles is that within the Bible, if you go to the Old Testament and the New Testament, you'll find that they're recurring cycles. And it's essentially the same message of how God is going to save us, but it's repeated again and again and again. And we discussed about how initially there was Abraham chosen to spread the message to the rest of the world of how God is going to save humanity. And then after that, Abraham's descendants, which were called the children of Israel, did that work. And then after that, in the New Testament, it was opened up to Jews and Gentiles, so everyone was included and it became worldwide. So in the Old Testament, it was localized to Jerusalem, Judea, and just that Middle East area. But then nowadays it's completely open worldwide and we are all tasked with that job that initially had been given only to the children of Israel, the Jews. And then the second thing that came out from the cycles is that in the Old Testament, when things were spoken of, those things were actually just literal. Like if they said something about Babylon, it was literal Babylon. Something about Jerusalem, it was literal Jerusalem. Whereas now in the New Testament times and onwards, if we talk about Babylon, we're not talking about the literal place Babylon because it doesn't exist anymore, but it's more a spiritual Babylon. So we are the spiritual Israel. So everything is now spiritual as compared to the local and literal back in the old days. So those were the 5 points that we covered, the 5 keys we covered. So this week we now start on the new keys to add to the 5 that we had. So the one that we'll start off with is one of primary and secondary application of prophecy. So one of the big decisions you need to make before you study Bible prophecy is which books of the Bible should you study? Which books are prophetic books? So the primary books for our generation, for us who are living in the after the death of Christ in the New Testament times, it's a book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. So those are the 2 books that are primarily for us and for our times prophecy-wise. So the next question is, so what's the role of the other Old Testament prophet books? So we'll start off with the New Testament Revelation to make it, because that's nice and simple, and we'll get that out of the way to say, why do we say that Revelation is a New Testament prophecy book? So if you go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, and what you'll find is that with most of the prophetic books, they actually tell you themselves that I am a prophetic book for such and such a time. So Revelation 1 verse 1 says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. So essentially it's telling us that things that will take place in the future. And Revelation was written around AD 95, so it was after Christ had died. So essentially this applies to our generation. And it's a book that was that is commonly believed by most Christians to have been written by John. So if you go to the Gospels, so there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So if you go to the Gospels and you go to the prophetic section of the Gospels, if we jump to the bottom of the slide to the verse Matthew 24, verse 3, now he sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And what you then find is that in Matthew 24, if you read further down, Christ is explaining to his disciples, answering to these questions as signs of his coming and the end of the age. So in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24 is the one that deals mostly with prophecy. Now, each gospel has its counterpart in the other gospels. So what you'll find is that Matthew 24 has its equivalent in Mark chapter 13, and it's also the equivalent of Luke chapter 24. But the one thing that you'll see is that the Gospel of John does not have this particular section where Christ is talking about his second coming and what the signs of the age will be. And the essential reason for that is that God knew that he would give John a whole book of Revelation to write about this and expand on it more. So for Revelation in the New Testament, Revelation is the one book that is prophetic, and the other New Testament books will have sections and passages that talk about the second coming, and we'll touch on a few of those as we continue today. Now, the book of Daniel, why do we say the book of Daniel is also primarily for our day as a prophetic book? So the Old Testaments are arranged, the books are arranged into the different books, the books of Moses, books of the prophets, books of the minor prophets, and the prophets there were actually prophesying for that particular day. Example, so I've chosen 3 books in the Old Testament, for example, Isaiah chapter 1, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. So verse 1 is essentially telling you that these visions in Isaiah are primarily for Judah and Jerusalem in those days when those guys were kings. So Isaiah tells us when its time, its prophecies were for. If you go to Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. So what Jeremiah is telling us is that he prophesied before Jerusalem was captured and those were the kings who were alive as he was prophesying. So again, telling us that his prophecies were for those days, and then when Jerusalem was captured, then his job was done. If you go to Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 3, it says, he said to me, Son of man, I'm sending you to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. And you get the point that, so each particular prophet in the Old Testament actually specifies that I'm prophesying to the now generation, I'm prophesying to the now generation, to Jerusalem, to Judah, and they would specify that they're actually prophesying for that day. And the one difference is in the Old Testament is the book of Daniel. So in the book of Daniel, it's got 12 chapters, and right at the end of chapter 12, at the last chapter in verse 4, it reads, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. So Daniel doesn't start off by saying, I'm writing this book for the current generation, but then he actually says that God tells him that shut this book up until the time of the end. And then in chapter 9, I've highlighted this, a place that says to seal up vision and prophecy and to the anointing of the Most High. So essentially, Daniel is a book that was sealed, and then the prophecies there were for future generations and not the current generation that Daniel lived in. So it's the only Old Testament prophet book which was told, seal it up for the future. So with those two reasons, that is why Daniel and Revelation are the main primary books that we use for studying prophecy in our generation, our day and age. So what does primary application mean? It means that if you read a certain prophecy in the book of Daniel or Revelation, you can apply it to yourself directly and say, this is for us. Whereas the other Old Testament books have a secondary application. So what does a secondary application mean? So that essentially means that if you read something from the book of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, it was primarily written for the old time people of that day. But you may find that because of the cyclical nature in which the Bible is written, some of the things that were written back there, we can apply it secondarily to our world today in this modern day. So what do I mean by that? The easiest way is to look at an example. So let's look at the example of the end of the world. So we want to see what's going to happen at the end of the world. So if you find the Bible, the way the Bible describes the end of the world, it's described as the day of the Lord. So wherever you see the day of the Lord, that's talking about the end of the day of the world at the end of time. So the day of the Lord, by definition, is a day that God comes and he pronounces his judgments to deal with sin for people who are sinners. And it's also at the same time a day of God's deliverance and blessing for Israel. We are the spiritual Israels for us. So for us, the day of the Lord is when the world ends. And when the world ends, he comes here and he will deal with sin and the sinners, and he will also deal with those who have been faithful to him. So a New Testament example, we find that in 2 Peter chapter 3. So 2 Peter chapter 3, there's a title just before verse 10, which is the day of the Lord. And it reads, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burnt. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? Look for the hastening and coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth. And what you'll find is that in both the New Testament and the Old Testament, when it's talking about the day of the Lord, it will talk about destruction of the earth, and it will also talk about the elements used. Heat is the one that's commonly mentioned. Sometimes it's described as a flood. And it will also then talk about how in verse 12, where it says, look for and hasten the coming of the day of the Lord. Look for the new heavens and the new earth in which the righteous dwell. So It's a good thing for the righteous. So you'll find attached with the day of the Lord, destruction of the old, and then a new heaven and a new earth will then be spoken about. So this is an example in 2 Peter chapter 3. Thessalonians also has some examples of this, but we'll just stick to this example because we're just illustrating the principle. So we then go to the Old Testament, the book of Joel, chapter 2. Blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand. A fire devours before them, and behind them a flame. And the land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Surely nothing shall escape them, for strong is the one who executes his word. For strong is the one who executes his word, for the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? So this is Old Testament now talking about the day of the Lord, and it's the same thing. You see the fire burns, and then after that there's desolation after it's burnt. And the word desolate is a key word that we'll discuss later on quite a lot as we go through prophecy. And then it talks about how it's a very terrible day. So if you're not on God's side, it is a terrible day. Then Isaiah in chapter 13, and the verse I think was around verse 9 and 10, behold, the day of the Lord comes cruel with both wrath and fierce anger to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. So again, same concept, day of the Lord coming, destruction. Excuse me. So after looking at day of the Lord in the New Testament, day of the Lord in the Old Testament, the next question is it the same day of the Lord? And from what we have been studying, to say that Isaiah wrote for the people of his time and not for our time, we should therefore, following the same logic, conclude that there must have been a day of the Lord that Isaiah had been talking about, a day of the Lord that Joel had been talking about. And what you find is that true to the word, Isaiah said he is there to write for the Israel of that day. And their day of the Lord, where destruction was coming, was a destruction of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So what you find is that when we read in the New Testament about the day of the Lord, we are looking at our day of the Lord being when the world ends as we know it today. Whereas in Isaiah, the day of the Lord was actually when Jerusalem was the world. So when Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, for them, that was the day of the Lord, because it was a judgment of God because Israel had been disobedient to God. And then there was a second day of the Lord when Jerusalem was again destroyed in AD 70, but this time it was by the Romans. So what you'll find is that before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem the first time, there was one group of prophets. And then after the Babylonian captivity and they returned and they rebuilt Jerusalem, then Jerusalem stayed on until the days of Christ. And then when Christ died, it was destroyed in AD 31. There was another set of prophets after the return to and rebuilding of Jerusalem between that time and the birth of Christ. So those prophets, which include Prophet Joel, were actually talking about the day of the Lord, that being AD 70. So what you find is that, again, we go back to the cycle concept that we have. You've got the prophets before the Babylonian king destroyed Jerusalem. They form the first cycle, and the things that you find in that first cycle, some of them apply secondarily to the end of the world for us today. And then the prophets, after the return from exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem by Ezra and Nehemiah, those prophets talk about the day of the Lord, which is AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. But that's a primary application, and the secondary application can apply for us towards the end of the world. So therefore, what is the role of the Old Testament prophecies, to sum it all up? So if you look at this picture, so I couldn't get it to loop, so I'll just have to try and go back and then replay it again. There. So what you'll find is that this is actually a picture of a heart. It's an ultrasound picture of the heart. And then you're seeing two valves which are flapping. So this one here, So this whole side is the left side of the heart. And this thing here, this valve here is called the mitral valve. So this side is the right side of the heart, and the valve that flaps here is called the tricuspid valve. So you've got a valve that's on the same, two valves that are on the same level. One is on the left and one is on the right. And then let me just try and replay it again. So just look out for the things that flap at the top of the picture. Right, so the one on the right of the picture is the mitral valve, the one on the left is the tricuspid valve. So the question then becomes that if you're looking at this, how do you know which valve is which? And the way that you know is there's a concept of what we call internal references or internal landmarks. So if you look at this, the one on the right side of the screen, this one that's got a long thing hanging down there. So that's got a bigger chamber, which is on the left side. Whereas the one on the right side, the chamber is more triangular. And then there's also a ridge at the bottom, near to the bottom, which goes across the whole of the right side. And that ridge has a name, it's called the moderator band. And then the other thing that we look for when we're trying to figure out, is this the mitral valve or is this the tricuspid valve, is that the mitral valve actually sits higher up on the screen than the tricuspid valve. So when you can see both valves, you then have internal references and you can then tell with certainty which is a mitral valve and which is a tricuspid valve. Now, if I then show you a picture which is different and has only one valve, like this picture, so you can see that there's a valve that's flapping, and if I ask you, is this a mitral valve or is this a tricuspid valve, it's hard to tell because all of the internal references are cut out because this valve has been zoomed upon. So it's essentially the same issue that we run into. If you then read the book of Isaiah only and you forget the rest of the prophecies and the rest of the Bible and you don't put it into context of the whole, you end up getting lost. So that is a concept of internal references, and the way that we use it in prophecy is that if we study prophecies for today, so New Testament prophecies, and we find that the prophecy has been fulfilled, we go to the history books, and then the history books will confirm that, yes, the Bible said this and that will happen, it has happened. If we read in the New Testament a prophecy which has not yet occurred, we then go back to the Old Testament, to the previous cycles that we spoke about, and then those cycles then act as an internal reference or internal landmark for us, in that what we read, we then look at how it happened in the Old Testament, and then we know how it will play out in our day. We've got more internal references that actually confirm whether we're correct with the prophecy or not, because if you then study the whole prophecy and understand it all from now until the end of the world. And then if you find an Old Testament book, I'll use the book of Esther as an example, but there are other books as well. If you then study the story of Esther, you'll be surprised to find that that whole story of Esther is actually the whole story of the world and how the world will end, all used in symbolic language in the book of Esther. So these are all the things that we're going to be studying so that you see exactly what we're talking about when we get to it. So the other key number 7 that we found useful as our group studied is chiasms. The book of Revelation has got a lot of chiasms in it. And what is a chiasm? So what a chiasm is, it's a Greek word for crossing over. And what it means in real life is that if you have got a verse, let's say at the beginning, so we're using the book of Ruth as an example. So if you go to Ruth chapter 1 and you read Ruth chapter 1, you'll find that Ruth chapter 1 talks about Naomi being too old to conceive. And then if you go to Ruth chapter 4, verse 17, talks about Naomi receiving a son. And then if you then go to chapter 2 of that book, you'll find that it talks about the possible Redeemer introduced. And then if you go to the end of Ruth, it talks about the Redeemer not denied. And then if you go to verse 2, it talks about Ruth and Naomi, their plan begins. And then if you go to chapter 4 again, it will talk about Ruth and Naomi's plan ends. So essentially what you see is that you go to the beginning of a certain section of the Bible, you read something, that parallels something that's at the bottom. Then as you continue reading from the top down and reading from the bottom up, you find that everything goes parallel until it meets in the center. And then the center of the chiasm is actually the key message that the Bible wants you to get. Like in this particular example, the key message is K, that Naomi and Ruth's plan to obtain rest. And that's covered there. So you'll find that the book of Revelation has got multiple chiasmic structures in which it's actually written. So the literal writing is in chiasmic structures in a lot of places. What's at the dead center is the key message that God wants us to hear and to understand. So an example, okay, let's get rid of these guys here. And then just look at one example of a chiasm from the book of Revelation. Okay, let's try and clear these, annotate and clear all drawings. There we go. Right, so what you find, this is an example. So if you look at Revelation chapter 12 and you start from verse 17 at the top, and if you go to Revelation chapter 15 and start at verse 5 at the top, 12:17 talks about the call to keep the commandments of God, whereas 15:5 talks about the 10 commandments. Then if you go to chapter 11, I will have to look at my verses and do them nicely. Sorry about that. But essentially, point A, okay, I see what happened. So B somehow jumped and went out of sync. So the starting point is actually A here, which is chapter 11, verse 19. So chapter 11, verse 19 talks about the sanctuary scene and the 10 commandments. And then if you go to chapter 15, verse 5, that talks about the tabernacle and the 10 commandments. Then move on to chapter 12, it talks about a call to keep the commandments of God. Then you move up to chapter 14, 12 from the bottom, it talks about a call to keep the commandments of God. And then the center thing is Revelation 13, 14 to 7, which talks about a call to worship the creature. And then it contrasts with Revelation 14, 6 to 7, which talks about a call to worship the true creator. So that's an example of a chiasm in the book of Revelation, and we will study a lot more. And that centralizes a message, the special message God has for that particular part of Revelation that you're studying. So the eighth section, the eighth key, is an understanding of the sanctuary. So when they were in the desert, in the book of Exodus, God told them to make a sanctuary, and then that sanctuary had different compartments. So this section here with the candlestick and this table here, which is called the table of showbread, and this altar, which was the altar of incense, that was called the most holy place. And then where there's smoke coming, there was a curtain dividing that, and that was the most holy place. So where there's a curtain, that's where the 10 commandments sat, and that's where God's presence was. And so that curtain closed so no one could see God's presence except for the high priest. Whereas in this section, the holy place, the priests could go there on a regular basis. So when you get to the book of Revelation, you'll realize that it's actually also structured that way. What you'll find is that there's 4 cycles of 7 in the book of Revelation. The first one is a cycle of the 7 churches, and that is introduced at the candlesticks. And then the next one is a cycle of 7 seals, and that is introduced at the table of showbread. And then the next one is a cycle of 7 trumpets, and that is introduced at the altar of incense. And then in Revelation chapter 11, verse 19, the book then takes you into the most holy place. And because there's one piece of furniture in the most holy place, there's only one cycle there in that part of the book, and that is the 7 plagues. And then what you also find is that within the sanctuary, the cycles come into it, because the cycles that are in the holy place at the candlesticks, the table of showbread, altar of incense, are all interconnected in terms of time frame. So there's a wheel within a wheel. And then the cycle that you get of the plagues is connected to the cycle of trumpets. So you still get these cycles everywhere, and they're all interconnected. So again, showing us the importance of cycles as we study. Key number 9 is understanding time prophecies. And this will take time, but it's fascinating, and it is very understandable. Revelation, an example of a time prophecy, chapter 12, verse 6. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. What does that 1,260 days mean? So that's what we study when we're saying we're studying time prophecy. The same thing in Daniel, there are time prophecies there. Example, chapter 9, verse 25, where it says that until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So what does all that mean? Again, time prophecies. So if you actually understand the time prophecies, take time to study those, it opens up a whole new understanding, not only to the Revelation in Daniel, but to the Bible as a whole. And that's the one thing that we've discovered, that as we've studied and understood prophecy better, we've seen that it's so interconnected with the rest of the Bible that you can't actually separate prophecy from the rest of the Bible. So books like Proverbs, where you're not expecting to see prophecy, you actually start seeing that, hey, this chapter here ties in with this chapter in Revelation. So your whole Bible opens up once you understand prophecy. The last and the most important key when you're studying prophecy is to know that God is love. So the whole purpose of the Bible is to unveil the character of God for us. And that character is a character of love, God being love. So you'll find that in different verses. John 3, verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. You'll find it all over about God's love. And essentially, God's love encompasses justice as well as mercy. So, for example, if God, when God is in heaven and on earth, he's actually running a government. All governments need rules. For example, if you in a city of Saskatoon, we've got speed rules here, they're there to maintain order. So rules are always there to maintain order, and there are always consequences to disobeying laws, whether it's the laws of the land or the laws of God. So essentially telling us that when we see God destroying sin, that's essentially the justice part of God. When we see God forgiving sinners, that is the mercy part of God. So as long as you are studying and you see these two things acting out, you see God's character being unveiled. So that is essentially one thing to keep in mind whenever you study something and you think that God is being mean here, study it again, and then you will see that God is love. So those are the 10 keys that we have and that we have discovered in our studies. And if you apply these systematically, you'll find that it opens up your understanding of prophecy. Now, I have gone a little bit beyond my time, so I'll do this in 1 minute. There's one point of interest that I just wanted to throw in there. Essentially, last week we studied about the law of first mention, and what that said is that the first time something is mentioned in the Bible, it's got special significance. So just wanted to give another example of that. So you ask yourself a question, what was the very first question that was ever mentioned in the Bible? So you flip through Genesis and you'll find that Genesis 3:9 says that then the Lord called to Adam and said to him, where are you? So that's the first question. So because it's the first mention of a question, it's got special significance. Go to the New Testament, ask yourself, what is the first question ever asked in the New Testament? You find that in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. And there it says, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So these are the wise men from the east who are coming. They saw a star, they followed it, and they are looking for Christ the Savior because they know that that's the significance of that star. So you look at these two times that the questions are asked for the first time in the Bible. In the Old Testament, Genesis, God is looking for man and he's saying, man, where are you hiding? And then in the New Testament, man is looking for a savior, and man actually finds the savior when he goes looking for him. And that is entirely the story of salvation encapsulated there, the story of God's plan to save man. And as Jeremiah 29:13 says, and you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart, which is what the wise men from the east did. And essentially in prophecy, this is what we will discover, that as you study prophecy, you will find God. So my hope and prayer for all of us is that we enjoy the studies when we dig into the book of Daniel chapter 1 next week. And this is where I stop and we open the floor for questions. So I will hand back to the host